Today's speaker is Jacob Kashiwagi. I am Mary Ressler, and I'm Councils and Components Specialist for IFMA. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with the PDF version of the presentation, will be sent out to the corporate facility members afterwards. Everyone has been placed on mute, so if there are any questions, please type them into the chat box, and Jacob will be answering as he goes. And I'll turn it over to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, good morning, everyone. I have to be honest, I don't really like doing webinars. I can't see the people, and questions are difficult because oftentimes when people ask questions, they're thinking something in their mind, but it doesn't always get written down as succinctly or as accurately as they would like. So I'm often trying to figure out what you want to know. If you ask questions, please try and think about it from my side. If I'm reading the question, you know, what I will be seeing. And that might make the conversation a little bit more effective. And we're going to get right into this. And it seems that, here we go. You know, measurement has been around for a long time. The idea to use measurements to manage vendors and personnel is not a new idea. There's a lot of different reasons why, or the purpose of measurements as we use them. If you can think of any other reasons, you can send them in. But I think this sums up most of the purposes of why we create measurements, especially in facilities, facility management. And so my question was, if that's the purpose of measurements, well, what are our problems with measurements today? And these are the lists. This is the list I came up with. And I started to realize that the same problems that we have is the reason why we are doing measurements. But this was a problem for me, because measurements should be eliminating this problem, especially since it's been around for so long. But the problem still exists, which immediately told me that something has to change. When it comes down to it, this is the real reason we measure. We're looking for a way to reduce project costs, but not just to lower them, but to reduce them through cutting out waste and risk. We want increased customer satisfaction, and really we want to free up money. Today we're going to go over just a couple of very simple ideas. They are simple, but they are very counterintuitive, especially if you're an engineer. If you're an engineer like me, you have to bear with me here. If you are confused or if you have any questions, please ask them, because the ideas, even though they're simple, they can be difficult because it goes against all of the general practices and our training that we've been taught. This is the first concept. It's the idea of an event. An event has initial conditions and final conditions. The more information you have at the initial conditions, the more you can predict the final conditions. If you had all information at the initial conditions, you could perfectly predict the final conditions. This is because of natural law. because there's always a cause and effect. There's always a reason for things happening. If you don't have all the information, then your prediction of the final conditions could be skewed. But regardless of if you have the information at the beginning or you don't, the event will only happen one way. Now, why are we talking about the event can only happen one way and everything is predictable if you have all the information? Because with this logic, we find that the initial conditions set the final conditions. When you find that the initial conditions set the final conditions, once the initial conditions are set, as you go into an event, a project, a service, you find that any effort to change the final conditions after the initial conditions have been set really does you no good. So all of the time that we try to control, impact, or influence a project after the initial conditions are set, really what it comes down to is we are wasting our time and our money. This really has been the general practice of a lot of management ideas and management systems up until now. That we rush into a project, then we try and control, impact, and influence the vendor, personnel, or even just the conditions to try and create a better final condition. The concept we're looking at here is that if you want to spend your time, your effort, and your money wisely, you have to place more effort up front. This idea of pre-planning is not new, but it's often overlooked. This is the same idea with measurements, that if you're going to have measurements, they better be set up front. And everything better be settled before you start a project. Now, some other ideas that come off of this that can help you in facility management. First, who has a better idea of what the final conditions will be? Will it be the person who spends their entire life doing a service, or will it be the people trying to manage them? And of course, the answer is obvious, the person spending their life doing the work. The person doing the work, it is essential that they have the information, that they know what's going on. It's important to hire an expert. How do you know if someone is an expert? They know what will happen in the end. A person with more information at the beginning will have a more accurate idea of what the final conditions will be. When we do measurements, the person who should be setting the measurements and identifying what the measurements should be at the end, it always should be the vendor. Which means this actually alleviates work from the owner's side. The concept being, you hire an expert and you let them do the work, you let them tell you everything. But you know if they're an expert if they can accurately tell you, this is what we started with, this is what it will end with, and we can actually show you the conditions it will be at in the end with numbers. And we can show you how we're going to track these numbers throughout the entire project. This will allow the owner to be able to release control, have a good knowledge that the vendor knows what they're doing, and throughout the entire project can minimize their management and control of the vendor because they have the correct information that accurately identifies what's going on. It's important that we get this concept firm in our minds. Because from this idea, we can minimize, we've seen up to 80% of the effort and the resources needed to be able to deliver service on time, on budget, with high customer satisfaction, high quality. The industry, we split up into 4 quadrants. Everybody wants to be on the right hand. High competition tends to give lower costs. We want to move from the price-based to the value-based. What is the difference? Many people think it's cost. That you hire a vendor who has expertise, they're going to always cost more money. This is a false concept. The real difference here is just who is doing the talking. As we let the vendor do the talking and take control of projects, that is really what increases performance and increases efficiency. If you can think about it, you got 2 vendors. One vendor has high expertise. They can minimize risk down to nothing. Another vendor, they can only minimize risk down to 50%. Who is going to be more expensive? Always a vendor with 50% risk. Why? Because in order to get rid of that risk, the only thing they can do, because they don't know how to mitigate it, is to throw resources at it. The vendor who can mitigate risk down to nothing, they will always be more efficient and cheaper because they don't have to spend the resources to deal with that risk because they don't really have it. So as we move up in performance and in value and in efficiency, really the way we do it is we just let the expert plan the project and do the work. And so the first concept here is if we are going to have performance measurements, we want to let the vendor set them. If you think about it, if the client is keeping the performance information, it tells you a couple things. One, it tells you the client then is accountable for the service. And I used to think it was only a university that would hire someone to do a service and then take full accountability for that service and actually manage and direct and tell the expert what to do. But apparently it's more than just a bureaucratic university. If the vendor is keeping the performance information, you know they are the ones feeling accountable. They are also the ones with the information that can help them identify how to improve. The one thing we want to try and do is we want to get vendors from a reactive to a proactive state. We as clients have been managing and directing vendors so long that they have gotten used to and they feel very comfortable now with coming onto a project and just listening to what we tell them to do. They become very reactive. As we let them take the proactive stance of keeping and developing their own performance information, they will then have the capability to improve and to deliver better value. I want to give you an example of an IT networking project. This is at our own university. They finally bought into the simple idea of letting the vendor create the entire scope, measurements for the project. ASU used to do their IT networking in-house. In fact, they didn't even know what they had. When they went out for bid, they couldn't tell the vendors exactly what they were doing. They just told the vendors, look, this is what we think we have, and you tell us what you can do. And this was the final result. Quest, now CenturyLink, came in. Basically, they said we can actually maintain your network at about $1.5 million less than what you're currently doing it, and we can deliver about $1.5 million in added value. We told them that's great, But how do we know in the end that you're not going to leave ASU stranded with antiquated equipment and very dissatisfied customers? And they said, this is how we're going to do it. And if you can see on the screen, I'm going to try and highlight it. But they came up with a very good number right here. I haven't seen this on any other IT project. How we got this number is we asked the vendor, how are you going to show us that we have top-of-the-line equipment and that you're spending our money wisely? And they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to measure the amount we spent, the ratio between new equipment versus maintenance equipment. They went back, they identified what ASU currently was doing, which was 17% new, 83% of the money was spent on just maintaining. And you can see what they said that they try and do. And up until now, they have met, it's been about 3 years, they have stayed true to their word. To show us that they actually were spending this much on new versus maintenance, every quarter they give us a breakout of all the costs. In fact, before the project began, they gave us a breakout of how much money they would spend in each category for the entire contract, which is 5 years. In every quarter, they give us a deviation to that. So they say, this is what we predicted we'd do, and this is what actually happened, and this is why there is a deviation to what we predicted. And this is what we found out as we measured and we surveyed all of the clients. When you have good measurements created by experts, this is what a measurement can do. It can move decisions through bureaucracy. It simplifies the complexity, allows people to see clearly on what needs to be done. And this is what happened on this project. The CIO at the time, these were his statements. It was one of the biggest moves of information technology from in-house to outsourcing that was done at the university, and it was done very quickly. I think within a month span, everything was transferred. ASU now has turned. They do many of their services and projects through this type of method now. And it's simply just asking the vendor, what do you see, what should we measure, and what are those measurements going to be? The next concept. Now this, if you look at this picture, this is a picture of my, my great-grandfather and my grandfather. If you look at this picture, this is not really the poster for creativity and flexibility, right? The Japanese culture is very strict, very control-oriented, very authoritative based, and you can kind of see it even in the pictures. This is my family. As you can see, we're kind of deviating from that a little bit. And if you want to look at what we call dominant, something that doesn't need explanation, there is one of these people that isn't in my immediate family. You can probably guess who it is. It's my brother-in-law. He actually works with us. I'm here at Arizona State University as a professor. I recently got married in 2012. By the way, it's been the education of my life. I think it's something that every project manager needs to do because it helps them understand that they have no impact, influence, or control. But my sister also got married. And as I thought about it, this is what I found. As I get older, everybody is in silos, meaning Nobody really wants to listen to me. In fact, the older I get, the less people really want to listen to me, I found out, especially my family. And I started to realize that if I am to pass on my knowledge and the information that I get, the only way I'm going to do this and make people happy with me, I have to become what I call more dominant or simple. Do they want to hear me longer or shorter? Definitely shorter. Do they want to hear so much about what I'm going through? Not as much. They only want to know how it applies to them. And I'm starting to realize it's the same thing that we need to do in the industry. We need to become more simple. People now are too busy. And the one thing that really puts us in silos, especially as I talk to my wife and my siblings, they always tell me, but I'm different. Jacob, I'm different. I'm not like you. And you know, that's really the answer I get from many organizations. I was just with the State of Oklahoma Education Department, and I'm teaching them some of these concepts, that if you are hiring a vendor, that vendor should be an expert, meaning they should have more knowledge of the service than you do. And the superintendent, the assistant superintendent was telling me, Jacob, we're different here. Here we have more expert than our vendors. Everybody thinks they're unique. But in reality, if we lift our heads up, we find that everybody goes through the same problems, in the same concepts, really that work within the industry, work in our family, work in many other areas, wherever we're dealing with human beings. Everybody wants it short, and everybody just wants to know what they have to do. So for example, how do we make things more simple? This is one of the ways we make things dominant. The numbers have to mean something. Somebody asked me, tensile strength is 800 psi. Is that good? Well, it's a lot better than 100 psi. Will that stop my roof from leaking? Ooh. Will 1400 psi stop my roof from leaking? The answer? Most engineers will not be able to tell you because nobody knows. This is the technical type of information that we drop our heads down into a silo for, that nobody understands what's going on. As we move towards the right-hand side, we begin to see more clearly. It's simple, it's dominant, everybody knows. Average roof age is 25 years, customers are very satisfied, and almost 100% of your roofs have never leaked. You see, that's value. And that is actually what our measurements need to go towards. Do we want a lot of measurements? No. If you can narrow it down to 2 or 3, that's really all you need. I tell clients, the only thing you need to know is, are your clients satisfied? Is it on budget? Is it on time? Now, if you look at these numbers, this is from the ASU Dining Service. If you look at these numbers, what could make these numbers more dominant? You know, you look at the revenue. 30 million, is that good for ASU size? What makes things dominant is if you have a baseline. If you have something to compare it to. Measurements always become more dominant. When you look at this, yes, this is a lot more dominant. When we were over at the Netherlands, I was exercising, and I don't really watch TV very much, but this show came on, and it was a dog whisperer. And I think hopefully most people have seen it. But basically, this Cesar Milan, he is definitely an expert. And I'm sorry, I think I have a question. Okay, I have a question, and it's by Mike. If the vendor has all the measurements, when should the owner perform audits to confirm the work is actually being done? You know, this is a couple of things you should do if the vendor has the information. One, the vendor should always be sending you the dominant information. So you should always see the measurements. As often as you think is necessary, which as I've seen clients, when they switch and they have the vendor doing the measurement, at the beginning, you're going to want to audit them a lot. It's just a natural thing. You don't really need to be auditing them very frequently, but you're going to want to, and that's okay. As you see that they have the information and their system of measuring is clear, simple, and understandable, then you will drop the amount of times you want to audit them because it will just be a waste of your time. Should you audit their information periodically? Yes. How often? You know, I would leave that up to you as the owner, how comfortable you feel. But when you audit them, it shouldn't take you very long. You should ask them. You say you have 9.8 customer satisfaction. You should just have to ask them, show me how you're finding this number. Give me a couple of contacts that I can call and ensure that you're just not making up the number. And that should really be all it should be. Oftentimes, just by watching the service, especially if you're around it a lot, you'll quickly know. Hopefully that answers your question a bit, Mike. Now back to Cesar Milan. He is truly a dog expert. So what he does, he finds rowdy dogs with owners who can't control them, and he goes in, and with very little time, he quickly gets that dog to behave very properly. Another one is Nanny 911. You know, going into houses with rowdy kids, the parents can't control them, and going and helping the parents out. Now, it's interesting because whether you're dealing with dogs, children, or even vendors, what these people are finding is what? That when they go into the houses, it's not the dog's fault or it's not the children's fault. It's actually the parents and the owners. They find that they just don't know how to deal with their kids or with the dog. What they're trying to do is they're trying to control the dog or they're trying to control their kids through management or force even. And what they're finding is that doesn't work. You actually have to create a system or structure that deals with the constraints of the children or deals with the constraints of the dog. And this is the first great lesson. The greatest thing you can do to improve your services is you can hire an expert. Because once you get that vendor in, not even the contract is going to change your service around if they're not an expert. Now, there are a couple of things you can do. And of course, yes, if you got to do this, and I've learned this with my wife, if I'm talking too much, it's not going to be a good night or a good next day. But some of the things you can do if you have a vendor that might not be performing so well is you can shift the accountability to them. And then once you force them to try and sit down to pre-plan, to think about how they're going to measure themselves, when they've done all they can do, then you try and help them out with the information that you have and with your knowledge. And no matter where you are on a project, it will always help if the project is not going well. It will always help if you take a step back and you let the vendor be able to sit down, create a plan to move forward, measurements, and you just set a baseline, some type of plan to move forward with. It will allow the vendor, even though they might not be an expert, to try and have a vision of what's going on and what they're going to do. Should this be a lot of talking? No. If ever you're having, as a client, to talk too much, you know something is going wrong. Here are some examples. And one of the things we find that is a big misconception is that the vendor is causing the risk. Oftentimes we found, as we've implemented a measurement structure with clients where the vendor measures, as you can see, most of the time, most of the time, the client is the cause of most of the deviations. And we have found this over and over again. The state of Oklahoma, they've been running a lot of services. There's something unique about the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma, when they procure services, they don't hire an expert. And it's one of the reasons their projects have gone so well. Because they're able to rely on the vendor's information more. Now, many people say, well, if you have the vendor create the contract, you have the vendor take control, how do you ensure that they don't cheat you? Well, there's two things. One, in order for the vendor to do anything, they always have to get the client to approve. As a client, if you don't understand or you're uncomfortable with what you see the vendor doing, then you just don't approve it. An expert can explain what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what's going to happen very simply, if they actually have the information and they can see from beginning to end. And so you as the client actually have the final say, which allows you to ensure that the vendor has a plan that you can understand and feel comfortable with. And they have done everything. We've implemented this with, in fact, we've implemented this with the Army Medical Command. This is a large government organization. We went in, and their first idea was the vendor is a problem. They have an IDIQ contract for their renovation projects, and they kept thinking the contractors just aren't skilled enough. So what they did was they simplified. The vendors kept the measurements on every project. And while they were implementing this, they were able to get an overall idea of what they're doing every week. So every week they can see all their projects. They have a breakout of every vendor's performance. They can look at it by facility. They can use the dominant information to see where they should actually place their resources, which projects need help, and how long it's been like that. The PIPS process, as we'll go over very briefly, it is a measurement and let the vendor take control type of process that we've implemented. And as you can see here, as they move towards giving the vendor more control, you can see that the percent over awarded budget goes down. And when you look over the lifetime, you can see that most of the deviations were caused by the owner. And you can see the unforeseen events as the vendors become more proactive and take more control. You can see that even the unforeseen or the uncontrollable things, they have even gone down. The information gives us the impact, what's causing deviation, and they can actually compare it by year to see how things have changed. But the last concept that we're going to go over is an idea between how you can identify between an experienced vendor and an inexperienced vendor. And let me get the full slide on. A vendor that is inexperienced, we call blind, or in other words, they just can't see very far ahead of them. This vendor, the only thing they are thinking about are the technical risks. Why? Because they're the only people they can see, so they're only thinking about their own activities. A vendor that has not been through it before, they also worry about technical risk because they don't even know if they have the capability to do the project. As you move towards the right-hand side, a visionary vendor or an expert, they can see from beginning to end, and the only thing they worry about is everybody else. Why? Because they're an expert. They have no technical or risk that they control because they're an expert. But as you move and you gain more vision, the only thing the expert realizes that can stop this project from going on time, on budget with great efficiency are the people that they don't control. And so as they look at it and they watch it, the only thing they're worried about are the things that they don't control, identifying ways to mitigate that and those risks from hurting them on their project. If you think about how we manage and we measure, are we looking at the things that we don't control or the coordination, transition type things? Or are we looking at more of the technical details? Most of our procurement, management, and measurement policies focus more on the risk or the technical things on a project. It's no wonder that when you focus on the technical, you can see what type of vendors that correlates with. The reactive and the ones that might be less skilled. As we move towards this side, and we focus more instead of on the technical details, but asking vendors, what do you see and how are you going to mitigate the risk you don't control? It attracts more of the visionary vendors. This is an example of another idea with measurements, which is the measurements should be on things that you don't control.
Welcome to Go-To Training, online training made easy. There are 73 other callers on the call.
Say your software doesn't work or it's too complex. So this vendor is going to measure these criteria to identify, one, if the client actually can use their software. And if anybody at the end of this project comes in and says, well, it's too complex, we don't like it, the vendor can look at it and say, look, we ran a test, 80% of your people passed the test, and the one complaining never actually attended any one of the educational sessions we offered. That minimizes that risk very quickly. Our group has been doing this for a little while, and amazingly, it's taking off in the Netherlands. The whole country is actually, all their professionals are converting to this way of doing business. But you know, if in Europe they accept something from America, there has to be something to it. Malaysia is also going through it. At the University of Alberta in Canada, they've been doing it for about 3 years. And they've done it mostly on facilities projects, actually. One of them was custodial services. You can see their cost savings. Just amazing. And it's spreading like wildfire there too. And if you're interested in changing your paradigm, this is really what we need to do. Here's the entire process that we usually run. From selection, when we select a vendor, we ask the vendors, what differentiates you from all the other vendors? And we want to know in verifiable past performance information. We want to know numbers. Have you done 10 projects? Have you done 20? What is your customer satisfaction? What is your project deviation average? And we want the vendors to give us that information. It will minimize decision-making and selection. It will identify the high performer. As we move to clarification, only the highest ranked vendor will move to clarification. In clarification, this is where we want the vendor to tell us simply what is your plan, how are you going to measure, and what can we expect. And the vendor actually creates the scope, the measurements, and the contract. The terms and conditions, they always have to be in there, right? So the legal things, they just have to go in. Once the owner is satisfied with the plan of the vendor, the award is made, and you go into phase 3, which is management by risk minimization, which is simply the vendor creates what we call a weekly risk report. It identifies the schedule. It has the measurements up to date every week. And anything that deviates from the predicted measurements that were set is documented very clearly, and that's what management by risk minimization is. And that will be done throughout the entire course of the project. Here's an example of verifiable performance metrics. Not only do we want the claim that they're the best project team, we want information to validate it. And here's another way of looking at it. You want upfront everything set. Throughout the entire project, you want them to mark the deviations, identify the risks that cause them, have the risk management and the measurements. And in the end, you want all of that to be very clear. And really, this is the future of measurement and management. Okay, that's it. Any questions? Yeah, the concepts are pretty simple. It might be a little bit more difficult to actually implement. You need to have some people on your staff that feel very comfortable with releasing control. A lot of times people will say, well, legally it's not possible. And really what this is, it's not really a legal issue. It's really a way in which we do things. See, oftentimes we want the client to speak first. The client should explain in detail what they want. In this model, the client just tells the vendor, this is what we're thinking we need. You tell it to them very briefly, and then you stop and you let the vendor start talking. And through letting the vendor talk, you put them in a more accountable role, is what we like to think of it. But seeing there's no questions, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you attending today. And I think my email is on the bottom of this if you would like to email me with any questions.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And everyone, as a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll get that out to everyone along with the PDF version of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Mary.